the price, the items is actually coming from directly shipped from Singapore to Malaysia, to our location. So there is the exchange rate there, exposure to the exchange rate. Or if you ever went to visit another country, a foreign country, to Brunei or to Korea, to where? To Australia, right? So you will have to get foreign currency so that you could make expenses there, transaction there, right? So this is the daily life, the exposure of the daily life. So even the government are exposed to the risk, to the exchange rate risk, right? Because every government in the world, every country in the world, uh, is doing the international trade. There's an export and import transaction. So when there's export and import, means that exchange rate is there. You need the foreign currency to do business with foreign country, right? So what is the exposure of risk in MNC? It's already answered. It's the exchange rate. Is there any other exposure to the MNC aside from the exchange rate? So we talk about the exchange rate, right? Is it actually relevant to say that there's an exchange rate risk to MNC? Do you think it's relevant, or do you think it's irrelevant? Relevant, in your opinion? Okay. Uh, Alvin said it's relevant. Nagame said it's relevant. Jana said it's relevant as well. But actually, I mean, economics, there's a two sides of story. There's a two sides of opinion. One opinion saying that yes, it's relevant. The exchange rate risk is relevant to the MNC. There's another argument saying that the exchange rate risk is irrelevant to MNC. Now let's see, how is it saying that it's irrelevant? So for those, right, who says that, argue that the exchange rate is irrelevant, is because they said that the exchange rate, because the world is so wide, and MNC, they're not doing only to one partners, right? They're doing business with every most around the country, right? Around the world, the country around the world, right? So they said the MNC cash flow in numerous currency, it should not be affected by exchange rate, because the exchange rate have an adverse effect because of the movement of the currency. So could be, they said, let's say Malaysia is doing MNC in Malaysia is doing business or having a subsidiary in the US, and at the same time Malaysia is opening, this MNC is opening a new subsidiary in the South Korea, right? So it says that it could be the ringgit Malaysia could be depreciate in UAs, related to the UAs currency, but maybe at the same time, during that time, the value of ringgit Malaysia is appreciate in relate to the Korea, the won currency, Korean currency. So it said, because of that, because of the adverse effect, this could offset the effect of the exchange rate movement. However, of those who says that it's relevant, which I think it's really relevant, because you know, although when you are in MNC, although you're doing a lots of business in other currency, in a lots of foreign currency, right? usually the exchange rate effect will not be effect offsetting. Why? Because the exchange rate movement usually move in the same directions. The reason is that because you know that how the Europe country and you know how the US country um many how to say it have a major effect to the world economy. So if anything happened to the US, it will affect the euro economy and it's also affect almost to the worldwide economy as well. So that could explain why the exchange rate movement is moving at the same directions. So because of that, those who thinks that exchange rate risk is relevant to MNC believe that it will not upsetting the effect. So is that clear? And does it relevant to you? And there's another another argument saying that uh, when you do MNC, right, when you go overseas, you do business overseas, the exchange rate risk would be irrelevant because you saying that um, the corporation should be well versed. The corporation should be well diversified, should have a well diversified portfolio. So that is, I think, just an assumptions because for me personally, I think there is no such perfect, well diversified portfolio, right? Even it's a great MNC. So my my argument and the other part of argument saying that it's relevant because it says here many MNC similarly affected by the exchange rate. So this is continuation with the same movement of the exchange rate risk. So yeah, even if you saying that you are well diversified, you are doing investment not only in the US, but you're doing investment in other country, other foreign country as well. But because of the same movement, the currency move at the same directions, so high chances, you know, it would be difficult for us for MNC to create a well diversified portfolio. So yes, there's still at least few percentage or small percentage of the exchange rate risk. Okay, so you could read this later on, right? Uh, and after reading this, uh, is your opinion still the same before knowing their explanations? Do you still think that the exchange rate risk is relevant to MNC, or now you change your opinion? You're saying that no, the exchange rate risk is irrelevant to MNC. Are you still fixed to your early opinion? Fixed. Okay. All right. So um, let's move on to the next slide. So if everyone's agree, right, that there's at least small chances or there's at least small probability that there's an exchange rate risk to affect the MNC. So this is the things that you need to know to learn on the exposure, the exchange rate exposure. So uh, the definitions of exchange rate. What is exchange rate? Here it says exchange rate is the amounts of one currency needed to purchase of one unit of another. Now, what is spot rate of exchange? Spot, on the spot. So it says here exchange rate for an immediate transaction. And what is forward exchange rate? Have you heard about forward exchange rate before? Looking with this headphone, I think I look like a DJ in a radio show, isn't it? So have you heard about uh forward exchange rate, forward rate before? Futures, forward rate. Oop, what is happening? Yeah. Have you heard about forward rate before? I hope so. So the forward rate is actually to help you to hedge for the exposure. So forward exchange rate means an exchange rate for a future transaction. So let's say if now the exchange rate is one, let's say for $1, for 1 ringgit Malaysia, for us to buy $1, the value would be, I'm not sure, but now I think it's probably somewhere 4.2%. Is that? For the Malaysia exchange rate to US, right? So now it's 4.2. So because you're doing a business with the counterparts in the US, so for you to hedge the exchange rate risk, what you do is you purchase a forward contract. So means to say saying that in that agreement, the forward contract is an agreement saying that in 3 months or 6 months later, when you want to deliver the contract, when you want to make a payment of that contract, right? You agreed that the exchange rate would remain the same according to the forward contract. So whatever happened to the spot exchange rate in the 6 month or 3 months forward, it won't affect um, the exchange rate, the transaction rate between you and the counterparts in the US because of the forward exchange rate. So in the forward exchange rate, there's a forward discount when it's cheaper, and there's also known as forward premium when the rates become expensive. So we'll see that. Another uh, jargon or another terms that you will see in forex market, in the foreign exchange market, right? There's a spot rate, direct quote, indirect quote, gross rate, real and nominal exchange rate, the inflation and interest rate, the relationship of inflation and interest rate, hedging for currency risk. So this is the terms that you will see whenever we discuss about the exchange rate. I think since you are in your third year, right? Most of you probably, I think, are exposed to the forex market. I think you might, if you taking international finance, the IF, you learned about this, right? Comments? Are you still there? So in this chapter, we will just briefly touch on the spot rate, direct quote, indirect quote, cross rate, real and nominal exchange rate, inflation, interest rate, hedging, and currency risk. Right. So next, any questions so far? Do you have questions for me? Okay. All right. Great. So forward premium or forward discount. So how is it different? So this is an example. The Ruritanian ruhr spot price is 100 ruhr. Ruritanian is which currency is that? I think it's Russian ruble, right? So the textbook's giving you an examples of Ruritanian rare, but I don't think this is actually a country. Is this such country of Ruritania? Anyhow, the example is like this, right? So the Ruritanian rare spot price is 100 rare per dollar, and the 1 year forward rate is 105 rare per dollar. So what is the premium and the discount relationship? So for you to decide whether there's a premium and discount relationship, we see the changes here. So the for you to know the calculations here is that forward price minus with the spot price divide with the spot price, you will get premium or discount. So if you do the calculation, there's a changes of 5%, positive 5%. So in this case, right, it's positive to the dollar, means to say it's premium. The dollar is selling at 5% premium relative to the RA. So it's because premium. Why? Because of the positive value. Because the dollar is, it's premium to the dollar because the value of the dollar is appreciating. And here it says that the RA is selling at 5% discount relative to the dollar. Why is it 5% discount? Because the value of the RA is depreciated. Means to say is that because of the appreciations of 5%, the changes of the 5% exchange rate between the dollar and the RA, right? Because of the appreciation. Now you can buy more RA with $1. So means to say that the RA now is cheaper. So when you can purchase something at cheaper price, means to say that you are paying at a discount. So that is why we says for the RA, it is selling at 5% discount relative to the dollar. And so that is the relationship between premium and discount relationship. That is that. Questions? Do you have questions? I hope that's clear. This is an example, I think, from last year example, the movement of the exchange rate to 2021 example. I think now the exchange rate is performing better. I'm not sure. Have you looked into the exchange rate movement? I have no time. Have you looked into the exchange rate movement due to the war in the Russia and the Kazakhstan? Is Kazakhstan? Oh no, not Kazakhstan. Russia and which country? Ukraine. Sorry, my bad. It's the Ukraine. No, the Euro country is all over talking about the war, but actually there's war everywhere in the, even in the third world country there's a war. Even in the Arab continent there's a war. But I think personally uh the European in the European country, the US country is, the media there, the Western media is biased towards the developed country, right? So supposedly they should cover all continentals war. They should cover it and they should speak up about the other war as well as how they speak up about the war in Ukraine and Russia. So there's no, that is just my personal opinion, right? So if you check at the exchange rate, do you see any differences, the changes of the exchange rate? during this time because the war in Ukraine in the Russia, I think it started about a month ago, right? So obviously the US would be affected. Why? Because the the US is the persons behind the war, I think. Right? So if you look at the exchange rate, you could see the movement. Take a time later on after this lecture and see if there's is any effect with the exchange rate movement. All right, so measuring exchange rate movement, depreciations and appreciations. What does it mean? Right, I've mentioned that earlier. Depreciation means that there's a decline in the currency value. Appreciation means there's an increase in the currency value. This is the foundation. I think you know about this, but we just go to remind you what you have forgotten before, right? So that would be easier for you to go on with this lecture. Now, comparing foreign currency spot rates over 2 points in time, S and ST1. So when we do that comparisons, right? Examples of the calculations before, you do the comparisons, percentage change in the foreign currency value. Positive, it says it's currency appreciated, so it's a premium. If it's negative, the currency is depreciated, so it's a discount. So I hope this is clear to you. It's clear to you. Do you have questions so far? Where are we? We are at the 10th page, slide 10. So no more questions? No questions? Everything's clear?
No questions, doctor.
Okay, all right. So when we talk about the exchange rate, right? The appreciations and the depreciations, the value is fluctuate, it's increasing and it's decreasing. So why is that so? Why is okay? Maybe that's the difference that I need to reconstruct the questions. What are the mechanism between the changes in the exchange rate? Mechanism. Yes, obviously the slide says it's because of the demand and supply. Yes. So anything that relate to the changes in the price, you've learned this before in microeconomics, right? If there's any changes in the price, it's because of the demand and supply, nothing else. So in this case, the exchange rate change. There's a changes in the exchange rate because the currency price is different. The currency price is changing. So it's changed because of the demand and supply. So when this demand and supply, these two curve is intersect, right? The point of intersection between demand and supply, that is when we say it's the exchange rate equilibrium. That is when the exchange rate reach to the point of equilibrium. So the demand for a currency increase when the value of the currency decrease, leading to a downward sloping demand schedule. You could see that if there's more demand, what happened to the value of the exchange rate? If there's more supply, what happened to the value of the exchange rate? Excuse me. So supply of a currency for sale increases. Oh my God, sorry. Excuse me. I'm fasting, so I can't drink. Supply of a currency for sale increases when the value of the currency increases, leading to an upward sloping supply schedule. So, equilibrium, as I mentioned, equilibrium of the exchange rate, as I mentioned, is the intersections of the demand and supply curve. Here is the graph of demand and supply of the currency. So you could see here the demand and the supply, and the intersections between supply and demand is the equilibrium point of the exchange rate. So this is the mechanism between the exchange rate. So how does the demand and supply of a currency, of a foreign currency, change? Right, so if that country is doing good and the economy is doing well, right? The investment would probably going well as well for that country. So if the investment is good, means to say the demand of that currency in the, for example, Malaysia, when we open up the border, right, in the 1st of April, I think, between Malaysia and Singapore. So there could be high chances that the economy would be recover and the economy would be doing well. So because of that, there could be chances of the um you know good environments in the investment. So for that, that could attract more investment to Malaysia. So because of that, there could be a lot of foreign investment coming to Malaysia, and means to say they're going to demand more for Malaysia currency. So when there's more demand for Malaysia currency, right, what's happened? Malaysia currency would be increasing. So that is interrelated. The same thing as when certain country demand more export, or when certain country do more import. So that could affect on the demand and supply of foreign currency as well. I hope that it's clear. So next, we'll discuss about direct and indirect quotations. So how is it direct quotation? So direct quotations represent the value of a foreign currency in dollar. So in this case, saying that number of dollar per currency, in this case, it says $1.40 per euro. So this is a direct quotation. So let's say if you go to the BNM, if you go to the Central Bank Malaysia, right, and you look at the exchange rate there, Ringgit Malaysia value per other currency, foreign currency value, we call it as a direct quotations of Ringgit Malaysia. How is it indirect quotation? Is when you quote the exchange rate in the foreign currency first per dollar or per Ringgit Malaysia, example. So in this case, indirect quotation is euro 0.7143 per dollar. That is indirect. So I hope it's clear to you what is direct and indirect quotation. Now, if you look at here, right, so this is the example. So it says here euro 1.217. Those with the mark here is the direct quote. United Kingdom 1.39. So it means to say when is the direct quote? How do you say it? Direct quote. So assumes that it's against USD. So 1.217, how do you quote that? How do you say it? if it's a direct quote. $1 to 1.2170. So you would say it's $1, 2.17 to €1. Direct quote. Remember, I give you an example before. Let's go to the previous slides. Excuse me. Slide. Can you hear me? Okay. So it's for the direct quotes, right? According to the example, if you still remember. So for your euro, you should quote this like 1.217 dollar per euro. That is direct quotes. Here it should be for pounds, direct quote saying $1.393 per pound. That is direct quote. Indirect, indirect, for example, in the Brazil, here it says 3.484 real per dollar. That is indirect quote. So can any one of you give another example? Oh, there's only one direct quote here. How to say the quotes for Australia dollar to USD? How do you say that? 1.322. This is indirect quote. So how do you quote that? If it's indirect quote. You could type or you could answer me. Yes, if it's indirect, it says 1.322 Australian dollar per dollar. So I hope it's very clear to you what's the difference between the direct quotes and the indirect quotes. Right, so shall we proceed to the next slide? So there's a cross exchange rate as well. So what is cross exchange rate? So the cross exchange rate is the amounts of one foreign currency per unit of another foreign currency. So it's an exchange rate between two currency computed by reference to a third currency. So usually the US dollar. For example, right here, the question is asking you to find the cross rate between Hong Kong and Canada exchange rate. Is there any Hong Kong here? Oh, Hong Kong and Canada. Canada. So you know that all of this exchange rate here is in USD. Exchange rate against USD. But if you want to find the exchange rate Hong Kong and Canada, this is what we call as the cross rate. Okay, so I think there shouldn't be any problem for you to do the calculations, right? How to find the cross rate between these two. All right, so we'll discuss more about this in the tutorial class. Right, next. Any question? Sorry, excuse me. Do you have questions for me? No questions so far? I hope everything's clear. Now, we will talk about the theory in the exchange rate. Right? So are you familiar with the law of one price? It's one price, not one piece. Are you familiar with it? Law of one price? Have you heard about that? So in the theory of law of one price, right, it says theory that prices of goods in all countries should be equal when translated to a common currency. So in this case, in any common textbook, the case would be about the Big Mac index. Is a well-known one, well-known example. All right, so here it says the local price. Is my voice clear?
Yes,
So it's okay. So here it shares here the local price converted to USD, the Big Mac price. So the Big Mac price in the Australia converted to USD 4.71, Brazil 5.11, China 3.17, Malaysia. Do you think that this theory is acceptable, law of one price, that across the world, right, this is one price? The price should be equal when translated to the common currency. However, if you look at this table, so it said local price converted to the USD. There's no such things. Australia burger, Big Mac burger, right? If it's converted to the USD, the price is 4.71. How about Malaysia? If it's converted to the USE, Malaysia Big Mac, the price is 1560. If it's converted, how much is that? 4.1804. So you could see that the price here is different. It's not equal. Supposedly, when there's a law of one price, right? All of the Big Mac price, regardless of which country you are, when we translated that to USD, it would become the same. So 3.7. So the Big Mac price, if you converted that to the USD, it would become 3.7 USD. Okay. Now that is one theory, law of one price. Another theory that you will need to know is the purchasing power parity. So what is it? So purchasing power parity is a theory that cost of living in a different country is equal and that exchange rate adjusts to offset inflation differential across country. Of course, I'm not sure if you agree with this theory, but of course, this is just a theory, right? It's not practical. the practicality of the theory is questionable. There's a questionable, but there's the reasons why whenever we do a research, whenever we want to investigate the relationship, we refer back to the theory. Why? Because there's supposed to be a main reference, this theory. So purchasing power parity says that the cost of living in different countries is equal and that the exchange rate adjusts to offset inflation difference across countries. So this is the formula. Just for your knowledge, right? And another theory that could relate relate to the exchange rate is the international Fisher effect. So the international Fisher effect explain the relationship between the exchange rate and the interest rate. The purchasing power parity is explained the relationship between the exchange rate and inflation, while the law of one price is explaining the theory of prices across the country. So what is this international Fisher effect saying? It says that this theory that explain that real interest rate in all countries should be equal, with differences in nominal rate reflecting differences in expected inflation. So this is the interest rate. So if you what are the common things that you could point out? I mean, in regards to the three theory that we have discussed earlier, the law of one price, the theory of interest rate parity theory, the international Fisher effect. What are the common things that you notice about all these three theory? Class, the exchange rate. What else? If you notice that all of this theory, there's always one assumption. It assumes that regardless of the changes in the exchange rate, regardless of the changes in the inflation, or regardless of the changes in the exchange rate or inflation, regardless of that, right? The value should be equal. Yes, Cassie. It should be equal. That is the theory. All right, so to summarize, we'll see how this factor affect the exchange rate. So there's two types of factors here. Number one is the trade-related factors, and the second part is in the financial factors. So you could see here, right, the trade-related factor, there's an inflation differential, income differential, and government trade restrictions. So this is in regards to the trading between the import and export between two different countries. So these three factors could affect the exchange rate. Why? As I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the mechanism of the exchange rate, the demand and supply. So when there's a exchange, when there's a differences or changes in the inflation or income of the government trade restriction, of course, the import and the numbers of export and import would be affected as well. And because of that, it will directly affect on the demand and the supply of the foreign currency. Hence, we says that could be the factors that affect the exchange rate. That is what we call as a trade-related factors that affect on the import and export of a country. Remember that. And for the financial factors means financing. This, how is it affect on the exchange rate? Is another factors under financial factors. The component would be interest rate, capital flow restrictions, and the exchange rate expectation, the speculations. So all of this, the financial factor, obviously in between it will affect the demand and the supply. Here it says financial factor, the demand and the supplies of the security, because we talk about financings, right? Security. So when there's changes or differences in the demand and supply of a foreign currency or foreign securities, obviously it affects the demand and supply of the currency, and hence it affects the exchange rate. So remember, all of this relates to the demand and supply of the exchange rate. That the changes in the exchange rate mechanism is the demand and supply. The changes in the demand and supply of the currency affected by the two factors. Number one, the trade-related factors. Number two, the financial factors. Alright, so I hope it's clear. Do you have questions so far? What time is it? 2:59. So if you want to know more about how the exchange rate movement affect MNC, I list down here a few articles. So if you have time, go and read these articles to see how in realistically a study, a research on the exchange rate effect towards MNC. So any questions? Right, so before we proceed to the next part, I think you need a coffee break? A 5 minutes break? Okay.
And doctor.
Yes. So 5 minutes break before we go for the forms of exchange rate exposure. Question regarding the FYP. Yes, Eleanor, do you want to ask? What do you want to ask?
Hi, good afternoon, Doctor.
Yes.
I was just wondering, for the collab with an NGO, right? Does it have to be an NGO or can it be like a company, an existing company?
It's not necessarily NGOs, yes. Because I mentioned the either it's NGOs or contributor. So it could be a school, it could be an organization, orphanage, or it could be a club, or it could be, as you mentioned, a corporations, a company. That could be.
Okay, I see. Because we have this idea because I contacted Pusat Correctional Labuan. I heard that they are in need of food items, like dry food items. And I was wondering if that would be a good idea. Because my group mates and I are slightly worried about the image, as in will people be willing to donate if it is with regards to, Pusat Correctional. Because my group mates have that concern, so that is also concerning me, even I don't think it's that big of a problem. So.
I think there shouldn't be any problem. It depends on how do you create the story. So
Mhm,
maybe you could start up with a campaign saying that everyone needs a second chance. You
mhm,
never know. How you sell your story could affect on how people take on your campaign.
I see.
So I can see that the collaborator here is the correctional center.
Oh, so they can be our collaborators as well as the people that we are donating to. Is that right?
Yes. However,
Mm-hmm.
if you have other collaborator in this case, right? If you're
Yes.
not in Labuan, so means to say you could appoint the other collaborator to execute your plan, your project. So your part here in this project is just to raise fund and to create awareness on the crowdfunding.
Okay, I see. But what if I am in Labuan and I can
Mm.
do all of those things, but I managed to find another person to collaborate with. Will that be better for the project, or should we just leave it as Pusat Correctional as our collaborators and the people we're donating to?
That depends to you. If you think that you could do everything, right,
Mm-hmm.
with the correctional center, that
Yes.
should be fine. There shouldn't be any problem.
Okay. All right. Think, hold on. I think that's all the questions I have for now.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, doctor.
All right. So last time, I think last year, this one group it doesn't say a correctional center, but they're working with the NGOs. So the NGOs provide some training to the student. We call it a student, or to those who are in this correctional center. So what they do is they're saying they want to raise money so that these people in the correctional center have chances to be part of the training program.
May I
So
ask what sort of training is it?
the the training, I'm not sure about that center. I think they are doing like say macam words training, computer training.
Oh,
They're
okay.
doing like sort of like online certificates, sort of that types of training.
Okay, I see. But because I think their permintaan quite specific, which is just food. I guess we're not that sure on how to market the fact that a Pusat Correctional needs food, because they are
Um,
somewhat like government, under the government, right?
Maybe you could ask why.
Okay, yeah. All right. I'll try to
Okay,
contact the person again.
all
Okay.
right. So, is that answer your questions?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, okay, no worries. So for you all to know, I've already shared the link for the attendance. Don't forget to sign in for the attendance today lecture. Question for Cheryl Tan. Is the collaborator a must or is it optional? Uh, how do you define a collaborator? So, for me, a collaborator could be, let's say, if it's an agency, a government agency, we could assume that's a collaborator. So usually, if you're planning to give, let's say, a basket of food to certain community, kampong community, right? Um, you don't usually go directly to the community. I would advise you to either go to the KPDN SCP or you go to Jabatan Kebajikan. So those Jabatan Kebajikan, the agency, government agency, could be considered as collaborator. So is a collaborator a must or is optional? It depends. Eh, Oh, sorry, the attendance link I um I share Privately. Okay, I need to share it to everyone. Okay. Pass. Alright, so the link's there. Okay. So is your question answered, Cheryl? So Islin is asking, our group just consists 4 members. Can we just proceed for the group assignment? Yes, you can. 4 members. Because there's nothing much we could do, right? With the lack of the members, unless this group with extra 1 members. Yes, Islin, you can proceed. So any more question? Okay, yes, but if we are going to crowdfund for a small OKU kebajikan, should we still need to go Jabatan Kebajikan? Okay. So small OKU Kebajikan, is this an NGO? So it says small OKU? Okay. That depends. Again, I said, if you could, you know, OKU Home Care Center. All right. So for that OKU Home Care Center, would that be fine? Let's say uh let's say if you want to purchase a necessity like diapers, or if you want to purchase a wheelchair for this home care center or OKU home care center, would they be able, this center, would they be able to purchase that on your behalf? If yes, then there's no need for another contributor. Not contributor, collaborator. So I accept with the OKU home care center. The OKU home care center could be your collaborator. Is that answer my questions? Your questions? We use the fund to buy for them. Yeah. So you see, when you want to work together, when you want to do a program or project with the OKU home care center, you're not supposed to just give a cash money to them, because the proposal should be in details when you prepare the budget. So there must be a purpose. Why do you want to raise money for this OKU home care center? Maybe you said you want to redecorate the home care center. Maybe you said you want to purchase because the home care center need a new kitchen, or maybe because the home care center need uh, like a computer lab. That depends. Is it the system? Could you not access the link? Let me check. I can. But it's gonna take times. When I click on the link, it says there's an external site, then you click on the continue. And you have to wait for, I think, about a minute more.
The page doesn't even load, doctor.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, why is it double my sound? I think I understand. Only one for GD30103 have that problems. For GA, no problem with the link. Okay, let me get the new link for GD30103 link. Okay, it's gonna take time even for me to generate the link. So while waiting for the link, yeah, what's happened? So your friend is asking me, what if the target amount, if you couldn't reach the target amount, what to do? So if you look at the rubric, right, there's an additional marks for you. If you reach 100%, you get 5 marks, if I'm not mistaken. If you didn't reach the target, you get 3. That's it. Because in this project, we don't really, I don't assess on the output itself. I also assess on the progress of the project. How do you do the project? How do you do in your presentations? How do you deliver the knowledge? If there is any transfer knowledge from you to the community or to the organization. Okay, I think yes, the system is having trouble at this moment. It takes like almost forever for the OBE UMS to open the system. So yeah, I will share that in the Kaisala later. Alright, so shall we proceed with the lecture? We have a few more, right? Can I proceed with the lecture? Are you prepared to proceed with the lecture? So, in the first hour, we talk about the exchange rate. How the exchange rate relevant to MNC? How is the exchange rate risk relevant to MNC? You've learned about the terms in the exchange rate market. You also learn on the theory that relates the exchange rate and how it's affect the performance of the inflations or the price or the interest rate. So all of this is related. Now we will go into the form of exchange rate exposure. So we know that the exchange rate is the risk, but how the form, how this exchange rate exposed to the MNC. So there are 3 types here. Number 1 is the transaction exposure. Number 2 is the economic exposure. And last but not least is the translation exposure. So if you look into this, right, transactions, of course, you know, when there's a business between two counterpart, when there's trade activities, trading activities between MNC A or MNC B or the same country or the same MNC but at a different country. There's a trading activities. So for them to do this, they have to do the trading in a foreign currency. So for that, the transactions, right? The money, the price that you have to pay, the transaction, that what we call, there's an exposure. So that is transactions exposure. Economics exposure is in regards to the environments, economics environments, in regards to the inflations, in regards to the investment, etc. That is economic. That also includes on the political exposure as well, economics exposure. While for the translation exposure, does it explain here? Yes, it's explained later on. So I will go first with the transaction exposure. So what is a transaction exposure? Transaction exposure is a sensitivity of the firm's contractual transactions in foreign currency to the exchange rate movement. So whenever you want to do a trading, right, you have to pay or you have to receive money. If you are the seller, you receive money, you receive payment. If you are a buyer, you have to make payment, right? So all of this is what we call as a transactions. And since these transactions incurred in a foreign currency, that's why we call it as a transactions exposure. The sensitivity of the firm contractual transactions in foreign currency. So how do you measure the exposure? You look at the exchange rate volatility. So you're familiar with the volatility? How do you measure volatility? So in finance, we measure volatility, we measure the risk by looking at the standard deviations or the standard deviations and standard deviation with the square. Another one is are you aware of that? If you root that square, it's become econometrics. Who's answered that? Yes, variance. Yes, variance. Great. Everyone's is so good in economics. Everyone is so good in econometrics, right? This is good. So the volatility measured by its standard deviations. So the changes in the exchange rate, the standard deviations or the variance, we could use that to measure the risk. We could use that to measure the exchange rate volatility. So if you could look here, this is the calculation manually. But if you do econometrics, you could just ask the system to do the calculation for you. You just key in the data and voila, you get that value, the standard deviations or variance. So now whenever you go to the advanced econometrics, you know that the standard deviations, right, is the fluctuations and also consider as the volatility. So if you're looking at the exchange rate, the standard deviations is the volatility. All right. Questions so far? Do you have any questions? So next is telling you exposure of an MNC portfolio. This is the transactions exposure. Measurements of currency volatility. You could read here. I've already explained to you. Currency volatility over time. So the currency says the volatility of a currency may not remain consistent from one time period to another. So MNC can identify currency whose value are most likely to be stable or highly volatile in the future. So you look at the volatility value. So if it has high value, if the standard deviation is high, if the variance value is high, means that it is volatile. When it is volatile, what does that mean? Means that the exchange rate is unstable. It's fluctuate. So, aside from that, you could use a correlation, the compute correlations for two different currency. Why is that so? So if you could do a correlation coefficient, if you could get the value, right, this could indicate the degree to which two currency move in relations to each other. So this could be as a hedging, or you could use this to do forecasting, or so that you could create a good portfolio, right? So if it's different, moving at the different directions, then I think that other currency would consider as a good offsetting instruments. So you should include that in your portfolio. And so that is why you calculate the correlations. I'm just curious, right? When you are you taking econometrics, advanced econometrics this semester or last semester? Do you take that subject? Last semester, right? So when you do when you took that subjects, right? When you do the correlations, do you also learn on how to apply that value? How is it applied in finance? Do you learn that? No answer. If you learn, that is good. If you didn't or you forget that you've learned about that, it's never too late for you to understand the concept and how to apply that to the finance, right? Okay, so next. Okay, now if you look at the table here, this one shows you the impact of a cash flow and correlation conditions on MNC. So if it's high, correlated. If it's low, correlated. If it's negative, correlated. If it's positive, negative, correlated. How that could affect the MNC, how that could measure the exposure to the MNC. That's why you do calculations. That's why you do these correlations. You find the coefficients of the correlations. So if you look at this table, right, you could see this equal amount of net inflow of two currency. If the currency highly correlated, means to say that it is highly exposed, these two currency. If it's slightly positively correlated, then it's moderate, slightly. If it's negatively correlated, then it's a low exposure. So I think all of this in this table is quite common sense to you, right? So you could read that later on, and if you have any questions, you could ask me. I also share with you the videos in Smart V3 about why Starbucks fell in Australia. If you look at that videos, right, I think that's explained on the economics exposure. Do you think that the Starbucks business are successful in Malaysia? Doing successful in Malaysia? Do you think Starbucks?
Yes, doctor.
Yes. Why? You, Wang Tek Yang, you does not represent everyone's in Malaysia. But I think it's probably because of the acceptance in our culture in Malaysia, the acceptance of Starbucks in our country. So anything that's relate to our acceptance to the Starbucks, that could be considered as the economic exposure. For example, the taste of the people in Malaysia. So we might probably love Starbucks because we think that the drinks is sweet. It doesn't really represent coffee. So because Starbucks have lots of other drinks as well, right? But if you compare that to the Australia, it's fell because of the coffee culture in Australia. Because Starbucks doesn't really sell coffee. They sell other types of drinks, but not really good coffee. So that's why it's fell in Australia, because of the culture as well. And another thing, why is it doing well in Malaysia? I think one thing is because of the how it's represent a personal, how it represents a person. So means to say is that if you go to Starbucks, if you hang out in Starbucks, means that you know you have that premium sense that say, hey, look, I'm in Starbucks, right? I'm premium, not discount. So that is one of the things I think that could lead to success in Starbucks businesses. And also because of our living standard in Malaysia. So I think the rate or the income of people in our country could afford to go to, most of them could afford to go to Starbucks. I think so. Yeah. So that is also considered as the economics exposure. But have a look at that video in Smart Vitri, and maybe I will open up a session there for discussion. Now we talked about the transactions exposure earlier. Now we look at the translation exposure. What is a translation exposure? Transactions is a trading. How is translation exposure? So here it says the exposure of MNC consolidated financial statement to exchange rate fluctuations. So I'll give you an example, right? The translation exposure. So let's say let's say Apple have a headquarters in the US. Obviously, the financial statement would be in USD currency. And at the same time, US have a different subsidiary in China. So the financial statement in China would be in yuan, right? So if you, when towards the ends of the year, if you want to consolidate the performance of Apple overall, you must translate the yuan exchange rate to USD. You must translate the financial statement in China to USD. So that is what we call as a translation exposure, because you want to consolidate between these two. So the translation exposure is more on the accounting methods. It's more on the it's more on the financial statements. So if you read here, it says proportions of business by foreign subsidiary. So if you have, say in the case of Starbucks, if you are for Starbucks, right, they have almost everywhere in the world. So if they had conducted business lots in the foreign subsidiaries in the foreign country, so means to say that they have high exposure to the translation exposure. Right? They are in China, they are in Australia, they are in Malaysia, Indonesia, everywhere in the world. So for them to consolidate the financial statement towards the end of the year, right? They have to translate all of this currency to USD. So that could means high exposure to the translation exposure. Let's see here what Nurujana says. For Burger King, it's have high competition with Ramly Burger. So I personally, same goes to Starbucks in Australia. Okay, all right, accepted. So right, so that is translation exposure. I hope you understand, and I hope if you have any question, you could straight away ask me if there's any. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Any more questions? No questions? So economics exposure. So what is economics exposure? Definitions. The sensitivity of the firm cash flow to exchange rate movement, sometimes referred to as operating exposure. Right, so exposure to local currency appreciation. How does it expose? How does it explain local currency appreciation? So in this case, right, I give you another example of economic exposure. Let's say Starbucks example. So the coffee bean is imported from a foreign country. The coffee bean in Starbucks, Malaysia, is not from a local coffee bean. So they have to import that from overseas. So for that, anything happen to the exchange rate, Malaysia ringgit Malaysia exchange rate, to the counterparts, the changes of the exchange rate, that could affect on the operating expenses of the Starbucks. That could affect the cash flow. So that what we consider as economic exposure. The exposure to local currency depreciations also. So all of this affect on the cash inflow and cash outflow. So I hope you get what I'm trying to say here. And let's say if there's a differences of the changes in the interest rate as well, that could probably affect on the cash flow of that corporations. So anything that affect on the cash flow to exchange rate movement, right? Sometimes it affect on the operating expenses. This is considered as economics exposure. Can you give me another examples of economics exposure? Hello? Can you give me another examples of economics exposure? What time is it? 3:30? Any takers about that? So here is another examples of the economics exposure. Most of it is related to the exchange rate, of course. Somehow it somehow relates to the interest rate as well. So if you notice here, there's a cash flow and cash outflow. So anything that would affect the exchange rate or interest rate affect on the cash flow, the corporation's cash flow, or the corporation cash outflow, that we consider as economics exposure. All right, so you could read that later. So to summarize about this, right? We could see that through the exchange rate risk, we will see that transaction exposure, translation exposure, economics exposure, all of this is related to the exchange rate. And towards the end, it's related to the cash inflow. All of this relate to the cash inflow and cash outflow of the corporations, right? So hedging for transactions and economics exposure. How do you hedge for transactions and economics exposure? So does political risk matter? Should you hedging or not? How do financial manager in MNC hedging for translation exposure? So imagine that you are the CFO, Chief of Financial Operations Officer. CFO, Chief of Financial Officer, right? How do you hedge for the translation and economics exposure? How do you hedge for that? Anyone? The easiest one? Can anyone answer to that? I keep scrolling on the chat, but there's none. Hello? So I am wondering whether this class is, there's an audience in this class. Operational strategies. What else? Other things? One says operational strategies. Diversify. How do you diversify, Wenchi? So diversify could be one of it. Let's say if you're planning to, let's say, purchase the resources of your corporations, right? The raw materials, you might probably go one part, you purchase that from Euro country. Another part, you could probably purchase that from the US. That could be part of how you diversify. But the easiest one, if you are a financial officer, right? For you to hedging for transaction or translation exposure by purchasing forward contract. So if anything happen to the exchange rate, you are protected by the forward rate. Whatever happen in the future, you are protected by the forward rates. You are hedging. So later, if you learn more about hedging, you know that there's even forward, futures, and options, right? So we will not go deeper into that. So here is a video about managing the exposure. Right. If you are in face-to-face class, I will show you the video. But this one, you could watch it. You could watch it later at home. So I think that should be the end of our lecture today. If there's no questions from you. Borrowing from local bank in foreign country, yes, that could be. Borrowing from local bank in a foreign country, that could be one of hedging strategy, yes, Tang Yufeng. Because according to the theory, right, regardless of the changes in the exchange rate or regardless of the changes in the inflation, the interest rate would be equal. That is the, what theory is that? That is the theory of, is it theory of purchasing power parity? Or is it a Fisher theory? I think it's the Fisher theory. Yes. So you understand why it's important for you to understand the theory as well. International Fisher, yes. So no more questions. If there's no more questions, I think that should be the end for our session today. So this is our